Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is his good and pleasing and perfect will. Also, just want to point out the NIV version is the really famous turn of phrase that I always remembered, like from memorizing this as a kid, was "be transformed by the renewing of your mind." I think that's I don't know. That's the way I always remember this verse being said. But changing the way you think is less poetic, but it's I don't know. It's a little bit more direct, and it's an interesting way to think about it.
That isn't a problem though. Like most of the verses I've memorized in NIV.
Hmm.
So I have to if I'm looking it up for the podcast, it'll be an NLT and it won't pull up. And I'm like, dang it. So I'll have to go switch it to NIV, find my verse I'm thinking of because that's the phraseology I know, and then retranslate it, which is just
Yeah,
kind of a funny thing if you're a Christian or I guess anybody who studies the Bible and you try to memorize it, whatever version you pick has consequences. Choose wisely.
yeah, and with Romans in particular, because you got the Romans Road and just like so many verses that I remember like memorizing for Awana when I was a little kid. If our
You did
listeners know what that
Awana?
is,
Wow. Yeah.
I did. Yeah, that's why I'm not ashamed because I'm an approved workman.
Hmm.
Maybe you can help me change the way I think here, Jeremy.
Okay. See what we can do.
So, okay, this whole idea of like non-conformity. This is like going back to the '90s kids thing. I remember the "Not of This World" T-shirts. Do you remember those, Jeremy?
I do.
And I think this is a theme that runs very deeply throughout Christian culture and throughout the Bible. The idea of not being like transformed by the way that this world is. Don't let the world affect you. Oftentimes it manifests in sort of an us versus them mentality of like we here in the church are doing things right and the ways of the world are evil. They're sneaking woke agendas into the Disney movies, for example. It's worth noting that, like, within context, right, the church in Rome that Paul is writing to is more of an oppressed minority, but throughout the past 2,000 years, Christianity has become much more popular, and especially here in America, Christianity is still the majority worldview. So it's I don't know, it kind of made me think like, what does that actually mean, like for Christians to not be affected by the ways of the world, because Christians have so much cultural capital in the world, especially in our own context here in America.
Mhm.
It reminded me a little bit of a quote from Harvey Dent from The Dark Knight.
You either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
I think this can resonate a lot with the history of the church and the way that they used to be this small oppressed minority. And many times throughout history, they've become a violent oppressor. Today, culturally, it depends on who you ask, but a lot of people would say that the Christian moral majority is currently like trying to strip the rights off away from people, and it's sort of this sad ironic twist in my view. But I wonder what you think about that, Jeremy. Do you think by demonizing the ways of the world, Christianity has become the villain?
It's a great question. I think the us versus them mentality can be very problematic, and the way it often gets used by Christians, I think, becomes very problematic. When Christianity focuses itself on we are the victim of culture, I would say it usually goes really bad. And that's, a lot of the worst expressions you see is when a Christian or a group of Christians, are become convinced like it's us versus these guys and these guys are oppressing us and we've got to fight back. And truthfully, I would say this is what Trump played into with his campaign, this idea of appealing to Christians of I'll fight for you. I'll make
Hmm.
things right. I'll get back, the influence that you once had as the church. And that was really appealing to a lot of people. Like, yeah, we need that. And I think it was because of this. We are the victims. We used to have all this power. Now we don't. We used to have all this influence. Now we don't. And I think that it's a problematic way to see the world because it invites you into, seeing yourself as a victim. I would suggest it's far better. We should be a beautiful anomaly as the church, not an angry majority. And yet oftentimes Christians want to be this loud majority. We coerce the government, we convince the government to rule the way we say, we make the laws the way we say. And this is really, a lot of the rhetoric you hear. So here's what I would say about the verse, because I don't think the problem is the verse. And I actually love this verse. I would say the problem is many Christians have not changed the way they thought. They think exactly the same way the world thinks. They just add a spiritual dynamic to what they think. So they spiritualize their own opinions, and that makes it even worse, right? So I would say the real problem is not this verse or this idea. The problem is Christians are not changing the way that they think, a lot of them. And where this is most painfully obvious to me is when I hear Christians argue for Christian nationalism in the US. It's like you are literally just mainstream taking this rhetoric of the world, adding in this flavoring to make it sound like it's godly, and it's disgusting. It's not of Jesus. It turns into white supremacy and patriarchy and all these other things that are not of Jesus. And yet it can sound so good the way that they pitch it. But I would say that what they end up doing is, I'm going to add a spiritual justification to their opinions, which makes, opinions of the world that much worse. And, it's been said, like, you're never more dangerous than when you think you're defending God, because you have this moral mandate to what you're doing that all of a sudden, any ends justify the means if it's a holy enough pursuit. And I just think that is a recipe for a lot of bad stuff. And so I would say, to a Christian, hey, actually, let's focus on changing the way we think. Like, not just us versus the world, but like, how do we actually think differently than the world? And as we're going to get into some of the stuff that Jesus taught, it's not coercive and, we're going to have more power and more control. It's the opposite of that. And if we don't see that, it's because we haven't actually changed the way we think.
It's kind of hard to know, like, who should be changing the way that they think, right? Because I can see why Christians would embrace this and think, I don't need to change the way I think because I was brought up Christian, so I already have the correct worldview. Do you know what I mean? And they would say, like, maybe like big picture, like the world has changed the way it thinks because the world has gone from Christianity being a small minority to being this massive world religion.
I suppose it depends on how you frame it, certainly. To me, this is like an everyday thing. It's not, hey, I was raised right and I have the truth and therefore, I'm just going to stand my ground. It's like, no, every day I need to wake up and go, Jesus, change the way I think today to be more like the way you think, and change my heart to be more like your heart today. And literally, it's like, I think I'll have that posture till the day I die, because otherwise I quickly go into, I can be just as drawn to power and influence and prestige as anyone else. And that can have its lure for me as well. So I have to constantly, even if I feel like I have, or I know the truth, I have to constantly go, God, change the way I think so that I'm not sucked into all this stuff that the world offers, which it would be easy to get sucked into.
When you were talking about Christian nationalism, I'm trying to think of, like, is there a secular nationalism that you see? Like, when I think about the political left, they seem to be generally much more skeptical and much more measured in their view of America. Like, when I picture someone who loves America and has like the American flag boxers or whatever, like I'm usually picturing a conservative Christian, which maybe is an unfair stereotype, but I'm trying to imagine what the liberal version of that. I suppose there are some people who really, really love Joe Biden or something, but I'm hard pressed to picture someone like that.
I think there's something there. I will probably share, the people who talk far more about love of country tend to be conservative, and many of them would call themselves, devout Christians, which I think is very problematic if you're trying to live out the church and you can't see the difference between your country and patriotism, and this radically other way of thinking that Jesus is inviting us into. But yeah, I mean, I think, on both ends of it, like, even if you go, okay, more the Democrat angle, which far less talk of God usually, but they still will, most of them will still say that they're Christian somehow or something, because they know to not say that you're going to lose, the Christian voters. So I think there's an element of politics on both sides of, like, all right, I got to play the game enough so I don't alienate, a whole segment of people. But I just think, that to me, it's like, let the world run the world. And we'll get into some of that next week in chapter 13. Like the world's going to function. There's going to be governments, like fine. But where we somehow insert ourselves as Christians and say, okay, now we got to be at the center of this. That's where I go, whoa, time out. Why do we have to be the center of that? Like, let the government govern, let people do that. Like that's going to happen. Right. But like, why are we feeling called to that? Why do we feel like we have to be running all of that? And, don't you want, the people, and I hear this all the time, don't you want the people making the laws, to be people who care about things that are, it's like, yeah, I do. Sure.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But that is so messy when you start thinking the way in which we're going to bring God's kingdom to earth is through the kingdoms of this world. And I just go, it doesn't play out well. I've read that book. I've seen that story. I have watched that movie over and over. Like it doesn't go well. It becomes like the world. And so that's where I think I would say to any Christian, now I don't care if you've been a Christian your entire life or you're a baby Christian and all this is new to you, every day is an opportunity to change the way you think and to say, Jesus, reset me so that I'm not functioning the way that I would normally function, but through your Spirit, give me different eyes to see different things. I think that is an invitation for any Christian. And any Christian that would say no to that, like, nah, I got it, I don't need it, I would just say that seems silly to me to not expect to need to do that every day.
I suppose there's a lot of different ways to take this. Maybe I kind of took it in the political direction, but yeah, I certainly see what you're saying in terms of more of the personal in your own life direction. Like, I think you could just argue like that this is a verse for the concept of critical thinking, and like you should always challenge your assumptions and not, the thing that you believe yesterday isn't necessarily the thing you should believe tomorrow. So yeah, I mean, I like it in that that interpretation.
Well, even Jesus, would ask people like, "How do you read it?"
Mm-hmm.
I think it's such a great question. Like, here's the verse. Yeah, how do you read it? Like, what do you think? And yeah, I love the critical thinking part of it. But this is where I would say all of us would do better if we challenged our thinking every day, right? No matter if you're an atheist or a Christian or wherever on the spectrum you would say you are. Like, don't we want better thinking out of all of us? So, if we're a Christian, we would say that better thinking is going to come from the Holy Spirit and from, the influence of God. But if you're not a Christian, I would say, I still encourage you to like change the way you think to be better always and figure out how you can do that and pursue that,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hope so. I mean, it reminds me of like kind of the idea people have of like always be learning, always be like changing the way you think in that sense. Sometimes I wonder if like, is that sustainable? Like, I think it's probably like the older you get, the harder it is to change things. I remember like before I turned 30, I had heard all these statistics about like once you turn 30, like you're set in who you are. And that was kind of this terrifying thought to me of like, I only have so much time to become the person I want to be. So maybe that's unfortunate that I kind of like started seriously questioning religion right before I turned 30. But whatever. Like maybe I'll just hold out for the deathbed confession, like the workers in the vineyard.
Well, if it makes you feel better, the being set by 30 has not remotely been true in my life.
Mm-hmm.
So I am not the same guy I was when I was 30 years old. And I suspect, I'm going to keep growing. So I think there's something to it. I also was told, this makes me laugh. I was also told like, hey, as you get older, you're going to become more conservative. Just, be aware, like when you're young, the liberal ideas sound cool and you'll be drawn to it. But as you get older, you'll come around, it's kind of one of those things.
Yeah. And yeah.
That also hasn't been true. So I don't know.
I know. Yeah. I feel similar. We're getting back into politics again, but I wonder if that is kind of a generational difference. If millennials are going to stay liberal, much to their boomer parents' dismay. Time will tell.